Classical Theism and Theistic Personalism. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion in theological circles over this topic in terms of the understanding of God. Who is God? What is God like? Now, the terms classical theism and theistic personalism are ones that were used and popularized by Brian Davies in his book on the philosophy of religion, where he outlines several views of modern philosophers in their traditional take on God today. And what he argues is that there is a classical picture of God that is different from the modern picture of God that is promoted by many theologians and philosophers and others today. And so we can broadly distinguish between these two views, what is classical theism or classical understandings of God. And here we're talking in this video, we're talking about Christian theology because that is the subject of this project here and of what I do. But classical theism does go even beyond the bounds of Christianity as well, because the ideas in classical theism relate to other theistic traditions, such as in Islam and Judaism, even as well as in some Eastern monotheistic faiths, and coming from Plato and Aristotle as well in the ancient Greek tradition, who have similar notions of the nature and being and identity of God. And theistic personalism basically starts in the 19th century. By and large, there are certainly ideas that come from this earlier than that as well. But in the 19th century, there is a large shift within Christian theology and in philosophy generally, which is kind of the tradition of modern philosophy to move away from older Greek ideas. But particularly in the 19th century, this affects Protestant liberalism, where it is argued that Reformation or medieval notions of God really need to be overcome by the Reformation traditions. And so there are certain theologians that argue that we need to change our views of God or continue the work of reform, moving beyond just the accepted medieval norms of philosophy that were accepted, for example, by the Protestant scholastics. So a number of thinkers start to reformulate understandings of God. Now, what happens in the 19th century is the emphasis turns more so to God as the ultimate person or the greatest person. And so the personal nature of God or the personality, discussions of those sorts become more prominent in, if you look at various, and this includes those within confessional traditions as well. You could look at somebody like Revere Franklin Widener, who emphasizes those things, who's a confessional Lutheran coming from that particular time period, though he doesn't deny the tenets of classical theism. Charles Hodge would be another one from the confessional Reformed tradition, who doesn't quite understand a lot of, pretty clearly doesn't have a great understanding of earlier kind of Thomistic philosophy or understandings of God. And so within the 20th century, the fruits of that really start to be seen within various theological traditions. Even within more conservative theological traditions, such as in the confessionally Reformed world or in the broader, more conservative evangelicalism. And basically, if we're going to boil down the differences, now theistic personalism is one that is a very broad term. James Dolezal has also used the term theistic mutualism. It's so broad that it could include more evangelical views as well as some more process theology and some ideas influenced by that as well. So it is somewhat of a broad term. But for the most part, let's define classical theism as an adherence to basically three general ideas about the nature of God that classical Christian theologians and classical theists of various traditions held to, that modern thinkers are doubting, questioning, denying. And so those would be, number one is divine simplicity, the idea that God is without parts. Now that doesn't just mean God is without physical parts or body parts, but there is no distinction between essence and attributes in God. He is a purely simple being. He's not composed of anything, whether that's physical parts or just divine attributes. Okay, God is not just a lumping together of various attributes. So that's divine simplicity. The second one is immutability, that God is unchanging and unchangeable by nature. This is one that is denied by a lot of theologians and philosophers today, who argue that there is something within the divine essence or the divine being itself that maybe changes through the incarnation or at the death of Christ. And along with this is a notion of impassibility, that God is incapable of suffering. Now, certainly Christian theologians have always been willing to say that God died or God suffered on the cross through an understanding of the incarnation and atonement. But the divine nature itself does not and cannot suffer as a human nature can. So we're not speaking about the assumed nature of Christ, but God in his very being does not and cannot suffer. It is against his nature. Now, I would say that those three aspects are kind of the primary ones that are being discussed in a lot of these contemporary debates today surrounding the nature of who God is. So in terms of classical theism, this is something that is being promoted from theologians of various traditions. There are several Roman Catholic thinkers who are very prominent today. Edward Feser would be one, and Thomas Weinandy would be another, and there are several others who are defending classical theism. But there are those within other traditions who are doing so as well. James Dolezal is an example of a Reformed thinker who is defending these ideas as well. Richard Muller, who is a scholar of Protestant scholasticism today, is defending that which is inherent in classical theism. And it seems like this topic is one that is growing. The literature is growing. There are several dissertations dealing with these particular topics. My dissertation dealt with this particular topic. Though I'm not giving defenses of classical theism here because this is supposed to be unbiased. But and the other school of thought, which is sometimes described as theistic personalism, theistic mutualism, there's various terms that are used. Some of the most prominent and able defenders of differing views of God that reject things like a classical understanding of divine simplicity and immutability would be Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and generally those who are more within the analytic philosophical tradition and those who adopt certain aspects of the analytic philosophical tradition. There would also be some of those who are within the confessional reform tradition that are challenging certain aspects of classical theism, and those would be people like John Frame or Scott Oliphant. So that's a brief overview of some of the things that are going on in the debates over classical theism and theistic personalism. Very brief overview, but this series is just for that, brief overviews of these theological topics. And we'll do further ones on those various divine attributes as well to give an explanation of what we mean by simplicity, impassibility, and immutability. So thanks so much for watching. Check out the rest of this series if you're interested. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Share it with everybody you know. We'll see you next time. God bless.